Hey everybody, I'm Margaret Rohde. I'm the Conservation Manager for Wissahickon Trails, and this is our first video in our Ask an Expert series. This one's going to focus on land and trails and preserves and some other conservation related topics. Alright, first question. Do you recommend setting up habitats for wildlife and feeding wildlife, things like birdhouses, bat and owl boxes, and bird feeders? Or is this detrimental to natural patterns of feeding and nesting? Along that line, what do you definitely not recommend? So we definitely recommend creating wildlife habitat in your own backyard in as many ways as you can. Feeding birds is a really great way to help bird populations, particularly during the colder months, so like November to March. At that time, birds need a lot more calories to maintain their body temperatures, so bird feeders can be really helpful for them. The most important thing about putting out bird feeders, and what I recommend not doing, is putting one out and not taking care of it. So when you first put it out, you really have to disinfect it, clean it out with like a bleach solution, make sure it's very clean, no bacteria, nothing in it. And then as you have it out, you want to change the seed every like 5 to 7 days, depending of course on whether or not the birds eat all the seed. If they clear it out, you don't need to worry about it, but it shouldn't be in the feeder for more than like a week. Birds don't really need seed as much in the summer. They basically switch to a diet of insects at that time, and that's also predominantly what they feed their nestlings. There's only a couple of exceptions to that: American goldfinches and hummingbirds. American goldfinches are vegetarians and they never switch to a diet of insects. They are always eating seeds. So you can put out a thistle feeder for them in the summer, just niter seeds. And for hummingbirds, you can put out a nectar feeder because they will never eat seeds or really insects very much. And what I recommend not doing with that is don't buy the store-bought nectar mix, just make your own, which is really easy. It's just a solution of 4 parts water and 1 part sugar. You cook it on your stove top, make sure the sugar is dissolved, and then you can store that in your fridge for like a week, 2 weeks, and it'll stay good. With hummingbird feeders, you definitely have to make sure that you switch out the nectar every few days, mostly depending on the temperature. If it's like 60 degrees and cool out, you can leave the nectar in there for like 1 to 2 weeks. If it's hotter, more into the 80s, you're going to want to change it every 3 to 5 days or so. If it's like 90 degrees or hotter, you're going to want to change it every 1 to 2 days. And if the nectar at any points get cloudy at all, you're going to definitely want to change it then. So that's kind of the key thing with those things. Make sure they're cleaned and make sure they're maintained. In terms of bird boxes, that's also a great thing for birds. Even in really residential areas, there's going to be a lot of species that will use them. Biggest thing with that is also maintenance and cleaning. So when you put them out, you really have to make sure that you check them at least weekly. And part of the reason for that is because you don't want invasive things like house sparrows and European starlings to take up residence. If they do, you can kick them out so that that nest box is available for birds that need them, like eastern bluebirds and tufted titmice and chickadees. So you're going to want to maintain them, make sure you check them regularly. You can actually leave them up all year. Birds will use them in the winter for roosting, so a bunch of them will pile into a nest box, and that's another way that they can conserve their body temperature in colder weather and also avoid inclement weather. You can leave the nesting material in there too over the winter because that will help a little bit with that heat retention. Just make sure you clean it out by the nesting season. So usually like end of March is fine for most birds. In terms of bat boxes, that's definitely something you can try too. Bats are losing habitat in a lot of places. They are pretty simple. They just have to be 10 feet up from the ground, about 25 feet from a tree line, and that's just to prevent them from being predated on by hawks and owls that are in the woods. Ideally, if they're within a quarter of a mile of water, that's going to be the best thing for bats. And you're going to want to face them south-southeast on your home or on a pole if you put it on a pole, so that it gets maximum daylight throughout the day. So none of these things are detrimental to natural feeding and nesting. They can help wildlife populations, and it's something that everyone can do in their backyard. The biggest thing that you can do for birds and bats is have healthy habitat in your backyard that is largely composed of native species, not invasives. these things are the things that are going to produce a lot of fruit and nuts and nectar for wildlife, so they will be resources in their own right that way, but they're also going to attract a lot more native insects, and that's predominantly what birds and bats are going to rely on. Okay, next question. Can something be done about all of the horse poop on the trails? If people with dogs have to pick up their pets' poop, why are horse owners exempt? Good question. So I'm glad that I have the chance to address this because I've wondered about it myself. And basically, horses are vegetarians, so they do not eat meat or meat-derived products, which means their manure is relatively clean. It has a very low prevalence of pathogens and bacteria and viruses, whereas dog poop is not natural and can contain a lot of those things and be pretty toxic. So horse manure will have very little, particularly of two waterborne pathogens, Cryptosporidium and Giardia, which make people sick, along with things like E. coli and Salmonella. So dog waste can contain those things. It also takes a lot longer to break down over time because it is non-natural. And as it breaks down, it can leach those contaminants into groundwater and creeks and waterways, contaminating them. Horse manure, on the other hand, it breaks down very quickly because it is made of undigested plant material. And as it does so, it kind of actually enriches the soil, so it's not a bad thing. So given all of those factors, given that it is much easier to clean up after your dog, and that it does a lot more environmentally, and given that it's pretty difficult to clean up after your horse, and has very little impact on the environment, especially at the scale that we see it on our preserves, we don't expect horseback riders to clean up after their horses. If they can take a manure bag and do that, that's amazing. If not, that's okay, we understand. If they sense maybe that their horse is going to go, then we ask them, you know, be wary of that and kind of move off the trail so that it's not in the middle. Next question. What goes into developing a management plan for a preserve? So we follow like a 4 or 5 step process for this. We begin by breaking up the preserve into what we call management units. So these are determined by habitat, so it'll be things like forest, meadow, wetland, etc. Once we have the habitats broken down, we have our management units that we're going to focus on. And then if we haven't already, we'll survey for insects, plants, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds to find out exactly what species we have on the preserve. And from there, we can identify what we call our conservation target species. So these are things that are listed in our State Wildlife Action Plan as species of greatest conservation need. And these are the birds and mammals and amphibians that are likely to become listed as either threatened or endangered if we don't do things to support their populations and preserve and restore their habitats. So once we have our conservation target species, we will look at their life histories and see what they need to survive. What kind of habitats do they need? What kind of plants do they need? From there, we will create goals for each of the management units, and then that we want to accomplish over a 10-year period. And then we'll create strategies and actual actions that we're going to do on the landscape in order to meet those goals over that period of time. And then we implement it. How much goes into managing a preserve throughout the year? This varies with each preserve and kind of by year. So if we already have a management plan for a preserve, which we don't for all of them because that's something that we're working on, then we might be managing it more intensively than a preserve that we don't have a plan for. So for example, one preserve might have basic trail maintenance, some invasive removal, and like maintenance of past planting sites, and that's all we'll do in that preserve for a year. Other sites that we are more heavily managing might have something like a larger meadow seeding or building a deer exclosure or a larger project like that, a larger planting. So it really varies from year to year and preserve to preserve. Are there any bird species that are uncommon or threatened that rely on your sites? We don't really have anything that's super uncommon, but we do have a few things that are listed as species of, like, Pennsylvania responsibility species. So these are birds, particularly birds, that have a really high percentage of their global breeding population breeding within our state, which means that as a state we have a high responsibility to care for their populations. So for us, that is mostly scarlet tanagers, willow flycatchers, and wood thrushes. So those would be 3 of our conservation target species when we're managing our preserves. Okay. Has banding shown that these sites are important for migrating birds? It kind of has. So our banding station only operates in the summer because we are specifically interested in studying the breeding birds that use our preserves for breeding. And we do it at Crossways, which is where I am right now. So we look at breeding birds. But when we start out in May, sometimes we do catch birds that are on the tail end of their migration. So, like, for example, a couple years ago we caught 2 Swainson's thrushes, a Canada warbler, and a mourning warbler. So these are birds that are on the last leg of their journey. They are tired, they need places to stop, rest, and refuel. Because we caught them at Crossways, and because they were in a good physical condition when we caught them, which we can tell by the amount of fat that they have stored on their bodies, we can say that Crossways is an important stopover site for them for that resting and refueling. And especially we can say that because they were in good physical condition. So those are just a few examples of birds that are migrating through that really need habitats like we have here at Crossways. And all of our preserves constitute habitats like that that are really important and vital for birds to have as they migrate through. What is your approach to the management of invasives, and how do you approach meadow management? Our approach to invasives management is really that we try to focus on areas where we know we can go right back in and restore it with native species. And the reason for that is because we know that as soon as you clear out an area, you're kind of leaving it more vulnerable to invasive species not only coming in but surging. So we like to be sure that wherever we're working, we'll be able to go in, plant more trees and shrubs to restore that habitat right away and prevent other things from coming in. And we definitely operate under the understanding that while invasives do benefit wildlife less, so they have less value to wildlife, they do still provide resources like habitat for nesting and cover to get away from predators, as well as food. So if we clear an area out completely and leave it kind of devoid of all of those things, devoid of habitat, that's not great for wildlife. So we want to be sure that when we do that, we immediately replace it so that there is some level of cover and food and shelter and habitat for wildlife. Just a couple red-bellied woodpeckers. And in terms of meadow management, that kind of varies based on the meadow. So broadly, we mow our meadows in the late winter, like February, March, when it's not going to impact breeding birds, and we monitor them for invasives throughout the year. If it's a meadow that we are more heavily managing or that we are starting from scratch with, then we will come in and clear all of the more detrimental invasives like Canada thistle and things that really are going to take off. And then we'll establish native grass cover, leave that for a couple years, make sure it is very well established, and then at that point we can come in and seed with a wildflower mix so that we create more species and more diversity for pollinators. And that usually takes a couple of years to kind of come to fruition. Why aren't your trails better marked? This is something we're working on, and we're really excited because we just named all of the trails on our preserves, and we are in the home stretch of designing new print maps for all of them, which are going to be available online for download. So we're going to have associated colors with each trail, names with each trail. They'll be on a map. You can get them on our website so that you know exactly where you are in the preserve. And then along with that, we'll be out reblazing the trails and adding some additional markers and signage so that you know where you are. And that's all of our questions. So thank you so much to everyone who sent in really great questions. I hope I answered them well. If any other ones come up, you can definitely feel free to email us at info@wissahickontrails.org, and we'll be happy to be in touch with you. So thanks again.